Chapter 1. A smart, smallish carriage drove through the inn gates of a provincial town. It was the sort of carriage in which bachelors ride, retired lieutenant colonels, captains, landowners having 100 serfs or so. In fact, those who are called gentry of moderate means. Its occupant was a gentleman who was surely no Adonis, but whose appearance was not too unprepossessing either. He was neither too fat nor too thin, nor could he be described as either old or young. His arrival caused no commotion in the town nor anything special except for a few comments exchanged between two peasants standing by the entrance to a tavern opposite the inn, which, as a matter of fact, concerned the carriage rather than its occupant. "Look there," one said to the other. "Look at that wheel. Think it'd hold out as far as, say, Moscow?" "It'll make it," the other peasant said. "And what about Kazan? I say it won't make it." "It won't make Kazan," the other agreed. And that was the end of the conversation. Then, as the carriage rolled up to the inn, it passed a young man wearing white trousers, rather short and narrow, and a swallow-tailed coat with some claim to style, which revealed a dicky front fastened with a bronze stick pin, its head in the form of a pistol. The young man turned his head to look back at the carriage, clutched at his cap, which the wind almost blew off his head, and went on his way. When the carriage rolled into the yard, its occupant was met by the inn servant, a waiter, as they are called in inns, who was so lively and twitchy that it was impossible to make out what he looked like. He rushed out, alert and nimble, napkin in hand, a long figure in a long cotton frock coat with a collar so high that it came almost halfway up his neck. He threw back his hair with a toss of his head and nimbly led the gentleman upstairs and along the wooden veranda to show him his heaven-sent haven. The haven was familiar, just as the inn was, the kind of provincial inn where, for 2 rubles a day, a traveler can get a quiet room, with cockroaches peeking out of every corner like raisins, and with a door, always blocked by a cupboard, separating him from his neighbor, a silent, dignified man, usually much afflicted with curiosity and intent on finding out every detail about the traveler. The outer facade of the inn reflected its inside, long and 2 stories high. The lower floor had not been stuccoed, and the dark red bricks had been turned even darker by violent changes in the weather and, anyway, were naturally dirty. The upper floor was painted with the usual yellow paint. Below were stores selling horse collars, rope, and hard bread rolls. In the corner store, or rather in its window, there was a vendor with a red copper samovar, and a face just as red, so that from a distance it might have looked as if there were 2 samovars, had it not been for the fact that one of them had a pitch-black beard. While the traveler was inspecting his room, his belongings arrived. First of all, a white leather trunk, rather battered and obviously not on its first journey. The trunk was brought in by the joint efforts of Selifan, the coachman, a very short man in a sheepskin jacket, and the valet Petrushka, a fellow of 30 or so, wearing a very loose, well-worn coat, evidently a hand-me-down from his master, a rather grim-looking fellow with a very large nose and lips. After the trunk, they carried in a small mahogany casket inlaid with Karelian birch, a pair of boot trees, and a fried chicken wrapped in blue paper. When all this had been deposited, Selifan left for the stable to see to the horses, while Petrushka began to install himself in the little anteroom, a dark hole into which he had already managed to bring his overcoat, and, with it, his personal smell, which also pervaded the bag containing his toilet articles. In this little lair he set up a narrow, 3-legged bed against the wall, covering it with a poor excuse for a mattress, greasy and flat as a pancake, which he had managed to wangle out of the innkeeper. While the servants were fussing about, sorting things out, the gentleman went down to the lounge. Just what these lounges are like is well known to every traveler, always the same painted walls, darkened at the top by chimney smoke and made greasy below by the backs of various travelers, and even more so by those of the local traders who arrive on market days in groups of 6 and 7 to empty their usual glasses of tea. The same sooty ceiling, the same chandelier with a multitude of all sorts of pendant glass that leaps and tinkles every time the inn-servant runs across the worn-out linoleum, deftly balancing a tray on which are perched as many teacups as there are birds at the seashore. The same oil paintings on the walls. In fact, it was identical to lounges everywhere, except that one of the paintings showed a nymph with a huge bosom, the likes of which the reader has probably never laid eyes on. Such examples of nature's playfulness, incidentally, often crop up in paintings brought into Russia no one knows how. Some are even brought back by some of our most eminent men who pick them up in Italy on the recommendation of guides. The gentleman tossed aside his cap, unwound a woolen rainbow-colored scarf, a scarf of the sort that wives make with their own hands and give to their husbands with detailed instructions on how to wrap themselves up. As to bachelors, God only knows. I really cannot tell for sure who does it for them. I myself have never worn such a scarf. Having unwound it, the gentleman ordered his dinner, while they were bringing in the usual tavern dishes such as cabbage soup with a pie, specially kept for several weeks to be served to transients, brains with green peas, sausages with sauerkraut, roast chicken, pickled cucumber, and layer cake, the eternal standby for dessert. While all this was being served, warmed up or cold, the gentleman made the inn-servant tell him all sorts of rubbish about who used to keep the inn before and who kept it now, and whether the present owner was a big crook, to which the inn-servant answered as usual, "Oh, that he is a great one, certainly, sir." In both enlightened Europe and in enlightened Russia, there are many worthy people today who cannot eat in a tavern without having a chat with the waiter and sometimes playing a little practical joke on him. However, the gentleman did not ask idle questions only. He inquired very systematically about the governor of the province, about the president of the district court, about the public prosecutor. In fact, he didn't omit a single public figure. Then, in even greater detail, indeed with downright concern, he inquired about all the prominent landowners, how many serfs or souls each owned, how far away he lived, even what kind of character he had, and how often he came to town. Then he questioned him closely about the general state of the province, any diseases such as epidemic fevers, deadly agues, smallpox, or some such. And the thoroughness and pointedness of his questioning showed that there was more here than idle curiosity. Besides, there was something very solid in the manner of this gentleman. And he blew his nose very loudly. It is not known how he managed to do it, but when he blew it, he sounded just like a trumpet. This rather minor natural advantage won him the respect of the inn-servant, who, every time he heard this trumpeting, tossed back his hair, drew himself up more rigidly, and inclining his head asked whether there was anything else the gentleman might desire. After dinner, the gentleman had a cup of coffee and sat on the divan, placing behind his back one of those cushions which, all over Russia, are filled not with resilient stuffing, but with broken bricks and cobblestones. Then he began to yawn and directed the inn-servant to accompany him to his room, where he stretched himself out on his bed for a nap. He slept for a couple of hours. When he had rested, he wrote at the servant's request his position and name on a slip of paper for the police. Going downstairs, the servant read out, syllable by syllable, "Collegiate Counselor Pavel Ivanovich Chichikov, landowner, traveling on personal business." While the inn-servant was reading the slip of paper syllable by syllable for the second time, Chichikov went out to have a look at the town. It seemed to satisfy him, as much as any other provincial town would. The yellow paint on the stone houses was just as hard on the eye, while the gray paint on the wooden houses was just as dark and discreet. There were 1- and 2-story houses, and some 1.5, with the eternal mezzanine which provincial architects find so beautiful. In some places, these houses seemed to be stranded in the middle of a street as wide as a field, lost behind endless wooden fences. In others, they seemed bunched together in a heap, and there he found more movement and animation. Here and there were posters almost completely washed out by rain showing pretzels and booths. One had a pair of blue trousers and the name of some tailor. Here, a store selling hats and caps bore the inscription, Vasily Fedorov, foreigner. Over there, a sign displayed a billiard table with two players wearing frock coats of the type that is worn by the guests who appear on the stages of our theaters during the last act. The billiard players were shown aiming their cues, their arms somewhat twisted backward and their legs turned as though they had just executed an entrechat in the air. Underneath, the legend ran, "This way to the establishment." In the street itself, there were stalls selling nuts, soap, and soap-like gingerbread. A restaurant displayed a picture of a fat fish impaled by a fork. And the most frequent sign was the dimmed, double-headed Russian eagle with the laconic inscription, "Drinking establishment," over it. Everywhere the paving was in a rather poor state. Chichikov also had a look at the municipal gardens, which were filled with rickety, poorly acclimatized trees held up by triangular wooden supports that were beautifully painted with green paint. Despite the fact that these trees were no taller than reeds, the newspapers mentioned them in describing the inauguration ceremony, stating that the town had been adorned, thanks to the devotion of its present mayor, with a garden of shady, wide-branched trees that provided coolness on a scorching hot day. And it was touching to observe how the citizens' hearts throbbed with gratitude, while tears of appreciation for the honorable mayor rolled down their cheeks. Chichikov questioned a policeman at some length about the best way to get to the cathedral, to the government offices, and the governor's residence in case he should need to go to those places, and then went to have a look at the river which flowed through the middle of town. On the way there, he tore down a poster that was tacked to a board, intending to read it carefully when he got home. He scrutinized at length a rather good-looking lady passing by on the wooden sidewalk, followed by a page in a military-style livery carrying a small bundle. Then he gave the whole place a final look, as if to fix it in his memory, and went straight back to his room, discreetly helped upstairs by the inn servant. After his tea, he sat at a table, asked for a candle, took the poster out of his pocket, held it to the light, and began to read, slightly screwing up his right eye. As a matter of fact, there was nothing very remarkable in what he read. A Kotzebue play, with Pop Levin in the part of Rollo and Miss Zayablova in that of Cora, was being presented. The rest of the cast was of even less note. Chichikov, however, examined everything, even down to the price of the stalls, and learned that the poster had been printed by the printing office of the district court. He turned it over to see whether there was anything on the other side, but finding nothing there, he rubbed his eyes, folded it neatly, and put it away in the case in which he usually stored the things he found. The day ended, it seems, with a helping of soup, a plate of cold veal, and a sound sleep during which his personal air pump worked full blast. The following day was entirely devoted to calls. The newcomer paid visits to all the important local officials. He presented his respects to the governor, who, it turned out, resembled Chichikov, neither fat nor thin, and wore a St. Anne cross around his neck. It was even hinted that he had been proposed for a star. But with all this, he was a very good-hearted fellow and even did embroidery on tulle. Then Chichikov went to the vice-governors, after which he visited the public prosecutor, the president of the district court, the chief of police, the tax farmer, the superintendent of state factories. It's a shame that all the mighty can't be enumerated here. But suffice it to say that the newcomer displayed extraordinary energy in calling on officials. He even paid his respects to the health inspector and the municipal architect. And Even after all these calls, he stayed seated in his carriage for a while, wondering whom else to visit. But he had run out of local officials. In his conversations with these dignitaries, he displayed great skill at flattery. He conveyed to the governor that entering his province was akin to arrival at the Garden of Eden, that the roads were as smooth as velvet, and that a province possessing such wise officials was to be congratulated. He said something very flattering to the police chief about the town's constables. And in his conversations with the vice governor and the president of the district court, who were mere state councilors by rank, he addressed them as Your Excellency, an honor to which neither was entitled, but which they seemed to appreciate very much. All this resulted in an invitation from the governor to spend that very evening at his home, and in invitations from other officials, some to dinner, some to a game of cards, and some to tea. The newcomer seemed to avoid saying much about himself, and if he did, it was only in general terms and with marked modesty. In fact, on these occasions, his speech became somewhat bookish. He would say that he was nothing but a worm, unworthy of much interest, that in his life he had gone through many things and had had to suffer in his career for his addiction to the truth, that he had had many enemies, and that attempts had been made even on his life, that now, wishing to find peace, he was looking for a place to live, and having arrived in this town, he had felt himself duty-bound to pay his respects to its leading citizens. This is about all that the town had learned about this new personality by the time he appeared at the governor's reception that evening. He spent over 2 hours preparing for the party, and in this displayed a quite rare concern for his appearance. Waking from a brief after-dinner nap, he asked for water and proceeded to rub his cheeks for a very long time, sticking his tongue into each one to make it bulge out while he did so. Then he took a towel from the inn-servant's shoulder and thoroughly dried his entire face, starting with his ears, after snorting a couple of times straight into the inn-servant's face. Then, standing in front of the mirror, he put on a dickie, pulled out 2 hairs that were sticking from his nose, and immediately afterward clad himself in a scintillating cranberry red frock coat. Thus attired, he drove in his own carriage through broad streets, scantily lit by an occasional window. But as if to make up for this, the governor's residence was illuminated as if for a full-fledged ball, and before it were carriages with lanterns, 2 doormen, and porters calling out. In a word, everything as it should be. Inside the reception room, Chichikov squinted, dazzled by the candles, the lights, and the ladies' dresses. Everything was flooded with light, and black frock coats kept flashing by, singly and in clusters, like flies on a gleaming white sugar loaf on a sultry July day, as an elderly housekeeper breaks it into shimmering splinters in front of an open window. The curious children gather to watch the movements of her roughened hands as they lift the mallet, while the soaring squadrons of flies, riding in on the light air, land boldly as if they own the place. And taking advantage of the old woman's poor sight and her being blinded still further by the sun, scatter over the tasty pieces, here singly, there in heaps, sated during the opulent summer, which anyway offers them morsels at every turn. They come flying, not to eat really, but to show themselves, to swagger up and down over the sugary heap, to rub their front and back legs together, or to scratch themselves under their wings, to stretch out their front legs and rub the tops of their heads with them. Then they turn and take off, only to return again in new, harassing squadrons. Even before Chichikov had time to have a good look at the place, the governor grabbed him by the arm and introduced him to his wife. Here, too, the newcomer did the proper thing. He paid her some compliment, such as is appropriate from a middle-aged man of a rank which is neither too high nor too low, When the dancers formed couples and the rest were crowded against the wall, he folded his hands behind him and watched intently for a couple of minutes. Many of the ladies were fashionably dressed, while others had put on whatever God had happened to send to that provincial town. The men here, as everywhere, were of two sorts. Some were thin, and these undulated around the ladies. They could hardly have been told from those of Petersburg, with their whiskers combed just as neatly, tastefully, and deliberately, or simply with pleasant-looking, clean-shaven, oval faces. They seated themselves near the ladies and spoke French to them just as nonchalantly as in the capital. The other sort of men consisted of the fat ones, or those, like Chichikov, who were neither too fat nor too thin. And these, when they did glance at the ladies, only backed away from them, looking around to see whether a green table hadn't been set up for cards. They had round, full faces. Some of them even had warts, and a few were pockmarked to boot. They did not wear their hair in a long forelock, nor in curls, nor in the devil-may-care style, as the French call it. They wore it short-cropped or slicked down, and their features were mostly full and stolid. These were the town's respected officials. Alas, the fat of this world manage their affairs better than the thin. Thin men are likely to go in for special assignments, or they are merely carried on the rolls and just make token appearances in the office. Their existence is somehow too easy and ethereal and quite insecure. Fat men never accept the, so to speak, circumstantial positions, only the direct ones. And if they install themselves somewhere, they do so securely and solidly, and the seat will sag and crack beneath them before they'll budge. They don't go for outward glamour. Their frock coats are not so well cut as those of the thin ones, but then there's God's own bounty in their strong boxes. Within 3 years, a thin man won't have a single serf soul left unmortgaged, while look at the fat one. He goes his way quietly, and lo and behold, he has bought a house in his wife's name at the end of town, and then at the other end, another house, and then a little outside the town, a small hamlet, and later, a whole village and all that goes with it. Finally, the fat man, after serving God and Tsar and earning general respect, retires from service, moves out of town, and settles down as a landowner, a hospitable Russian country gentleman. And thus he lives, and lives well. And after him come his thin heirs, who promptly squander, Russian style, the wealth he has accumulated. It was along these lines that Chichikov was musing as he examined the company, and the result of his musing was that he joined the fat ones, among whom he found all those faces already familiar to him, the public prosecutor with his very black, very thick eyebrows, and a slightly winking left eye that seemed to be saying, "Join me in the other room, I've something to tell you," although he really was the serious, silent type. The very short postmaster, who was nevertheless a wit and a philosopher. The president of the district court, a quite reasonable and jovial individual. All of them greeted Chichikov as they would an old friend, and he responded with rather airy, sideward bows, which were nevertheless quite friendly. Here he made the acquaintance of two landowners, the affable and obliging Manilov, and the rather clumsy-looking Sobakevich, who started off by stepping on his foot and saying, "Beg pardon." At this point, cards for whist were thrust into Chichikov's hands, and he accepted them with his usual polite bow. They sat down at the green table and did not leave it until supper was served. All conversation was immediately suspended as they got down to business. Although the postmaster was an extremely chatty person, as soon as he held cards in his hands, his face became the very picture of thought. He pulled his lower lip over the upper one and maintained this expression throughout the whole game. When he played a card, he banged it on the table, saying, "Off with you, you old hag," if it happened to be a queen, or Go and show him my music, if it was a king. While the president of the district court would answer with a phrase like, and I'll pull his whiskers for him, from time to time as the players threw cards down on the table. Phrases such as, let's just see what happens, or might as well play diamonds since there's nothing else, would escape them, or they would simply mutter, hey, hearts, hearties, or spades, spadies, or even simply spuds, and other such nicknames for the suits. At the end of the game, there was the usual rather loud argument. The newcomer took part in it so that everyone could see he was arguing too, but that he was being pleasant about it. He never said, for instance, you played the deuce. Instead, he would say, you were pleased to play the deuce, and I had the honor of covering it. To make his opponents accept his point more readily, he kept proffering his silver and enamel snuff box, at the bottom of which 2 violets could be seen, placed there for their fragrance. The attention of the newcomer was focused on Manilov and Sobakevich. He had called aside the president of the district court and the postmaster to inquire about them, and the few questions he had asked were enough to show that he was not merely a curious, but also a methodical man. He wanted to know how many serfs each of them owned, and in what condition their estates were, and only after this did he ask their first name. In no time at all, he had managed to charm both these landowners. Manilov, a man not yet middle-aged, with eyes as sweet as sugar, which he screwed up whenever he laughed, was delighted beyond all bounds with Chichikov. He pressed his hand for a very long time and begged the newcomer to do him the honor of visiting him on his estate, which, he said, was only some 12 miles outside the town limits. To this, Chichikov answered with a polite bow and a sincere pressure of the hand that he would not only come with the greatest of pleasure, but would consider it his sacred duty to make this visit. Sobakevich also invited him, although quite laconically, saying, come and see me too, and clicked the heels of his high boots, for which it might have seemed impossible to find feet large enough, especially now that the race of hero giants is becoming extinct, even in Russia. The next day, Chichikov had lunch at the police chief's. They sat down to a whist table at 3 p.m. and played until 2 in the morning. It was there, by the way, that he made the acquaintance of another landowner, one Nozdrov, an outgoing fellow of about 30, who, after they had exchanged about 3 or 4 words, started calling him by his first name. Nozdrov was also on a familiar first-name basis with the prosecutor and the police chief, and yet, when the stakes on the table mounted, these two kept an eye on almost every card he played and closely scrutinized the tricks he took. The next evening, Chichikov spent in the house of the president of the district court, who received in his rather grubby dressing gown, although among his guests there were a couple of ladies of sorts. Then Chichikov attended an evening reception at the vice-governor's, a big dinner at the tax farmers, another dinner at the public prosecutor's, which was not as big, but which must have cost at least as much, and a snack at the mayor's after the church service, which must have also cost as much. In a word, he spent no time at the inn, only returning there to sleep. Everywhere, the newcomer displayed presence of mind and proved himself a seasoned man of the world. Whatever the conversation, he always knew how to keep it going. If it was about stud farms, he spoke about stud farms. If it was about dogs, he would impart sound observations on this subject too. If the talk turned on some investigation made by the National Treasury, he showed that he was quite familiar with legal quibbles. If the discussion was about the game of billiards, he did not miss out there either. If they brought up philanthropy, he dwelt on it with tears glinting in his eyes. And about customs officials, he spoke with as much authority as if he himself had been both a customs clerk and a customs inspector. But the remarkable thing about it was that he could discuss all these matters with calm dignity, and that he always behaved in the proper way, never speaking either too loudly or too softly. In short, a man of substance, whichever way you looked at it. All the officials were delighted at the arrival of this new personality. The governor estimated him as a man of goodwill. The public prosecutor said that he was a businesslike fellow. The colonel of the gendarmes described him as very learned. The president of the district court thought him well-informed and honorable. The chief of police, honorable and amiable. The wife of the chief of police, most amiable and most gallant. Even Sobakevich, who seldom had a kind word for anyone, once arrived home from town very late, undressed, stretched out on his bed next to his gaunt wife, and declared, "You know, my love, I went to a reception at the governor's and to dinner with the chief of police and made the acquaintance of a collegiate counselor called Pavel Ivanovich Chichikov, an extremely pleasant fellow." To this his wife answered, and kicked him. Such was the general impression made by the newcomer. It was quite flattering and lasted until a strange peculiarity of his and a certain business in which he was involved came to light. But we are soon to learn about this matter which all but threw the entire town into confusion.